Hello. Just wait for the last few people to sit down. As the banner suggests above me, this panel is about embedding opportunity in society. And before sitting down here, I had a little bit of a think about what that means. And I guess in the words of Torsten Bell, it is about being able to build a better future and how to do that. And I don't think, well, certainly in my day job, I don't really talk about that. I mean, I write about interest rates, I talk about nebulous concepts such as growth, as you heard in the previous panel. And I think that's because we assume it's a given that, like Rachel D'Souza said earlier, that you walk into any classroom, ask the group of school kids, will you be better off than your parents? And you assume the answer is yes. But if you dig a little deeper, and in recent reports, I think you find the answer is not as homogenous as it used to be, which is why I'm joined by a distinguished panel of guests here. To my left, we have Sophie Hulm, who's Chief Executive of Progress Together, which is a think tank that focuses on diversity in financial services at senior levels. We also have Stuart Haire, who's CEO of Skipton Group, one of the biggest building societies here in the UK. We have Resham Kotecha, who was appointed by the Cabinet Office to be a Social Mobility Commissioner and is also Head of Policy at the Open Data Institute. And on the end, last but not least, Boughton, who's CEO of Thakeham Group, who develops property sites and builds houses around the UK. Can I ask the panel, starting with Sophie, just to give us your opening thoughts on the subject of the panel today?
Sure, thank you. So, yes, CEO of Progress Together, we're a new not-for-profit startup. We're a membership body, and we aim to level up the UK's financial services sector. So we know that at senior levels within UK financial services, 89% of senior leaders come from a higher socioeconomic background. And that's compared to 47% at junior levels. So we know that employers are working really hard and doing a great job on diversifying the junior levels, working to diversify the graduate intake, working with schools. But those individual employees are not coming up through the pipeline. And we know that working class employees are 25% slower at progressing than their peers, and there is zero link to job performance. We now have the evidence. And this matters because the rate of vacancies in UK financial services is the highest it has ever been. The demand for skills is outstripping supply. But we have the talent within our own organisations. And that's what Progress Together is here to do, to support employers to take action on this. And it's a peer network, so we support employers to meet with others that have already kind of gone down this journey before others. We're an output of a government commissioned task force led by the City of London Corporation. We only launched last year. We already have 37 members, and that they represent 30% of the UK financial services workforce. So there's some real appetite to look at the progression piece.
Stuart.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for inviting me along. I came from a working class community in Glasgow and now get to run a financial service institution, so maybe I'm part of that 11%. But the Skipton Group houses both the Building Society and also the UK's biggest estate agency, so it probably won't be a surprise that my answers and my commentary will focus on employment and housing. On employment, a friend of mine who runs KPMG in the UK recently did some research about employees they'd brought in, and they looked at the progression of disadvantaged groups, so ethnic diversity, sexuality, etc., and working class background. And they found that all of those groups had actually progressed except one. And it was those with the working class background that had not progressed at the same rate. And I put that down to a few things, but one of them certainly is to do with housing, and therefore the economic progression that people can go through with housing. If you're now a youngster in the UK, your aspirations to own your own home is not any more dimmed than it was in my day, and I suspect in all of our days. However, that key aspiration to many is now unattainable, and that's leading to greater social inequality, in my view. We get a decent lens on this, and 86% of renters want home ownership. 8 in 10, though, of renters feel trapped because home ownership is too distant, either saving up the deposit or indeed the cost of moving into the housing ladder. And 43% of those renters think it's impossible. So one of the things that we're quite proud to have done is we launched, much to critical acclaim, the 100% mortgage for those that could prove that they've made good rental payments and that where the mortgage would be cheaper. We want to give people the opportunity to own their own home, to put a nail in the wall, to put a picture up, etc., because that allows them to move to work. It moves away from disadvantaged backgrounds and actually pushes them towards opportunity.
Resham.
Thank you. So the Social Mobility Commission, and me as one of a number of brilliant commissioners, work to advise the government but also to hold them to account on social mobility. So once a year our statutory duty is to produce a State of the Nation report where we evaluate the state of social mobility in the UK. So that's coming out in September, so do keep an eye out for it. But when I'm asked what's the state of social mobility in the UK, it's a difficult question to answer because it depends what you're measuring. There's educational outcomes, there's income, and traditionally people would talk about social mobility and talk about class in terms of job, you know, blue collar, white collar. The reality is there are now a number of jobs that are not, you know, traditionally thought of as blue collar jobs that now pay you far more than a professional office job might pay you. We also struggle to classify working class or middle class because actually people's life circumstances change and people self-classify differently. So we measure by looking at what your parents did in terms of their socioeconomic background when you were 14 years old. And what we're measuring is what your life chances are compared to your parents' life chances. So on that measure, in the UK, absolute occupational mobility has been relative for decades. And in fact, relative occupational mobility, the job opportunities you have, has been slightly improving. And it's good compared to some of our international competitors like the US and Canada. I'm sure we'll come on to it very shortly, but in terms of housing and the opportunity to live and work where you could earn the most or have the best life chances, well, we're struggling on that. But there are lots of positive signs, so I'm pleased there were people here earlier who thought that the best was yet to come for Britain. In the 2010s, we've seen significant improvement in people being able to improve their social mobility. But we have to also accept that where there's upward social mobility, there's downward social mobility. So some people are doing less well than their parents did. And unfortunately, as some of you will have thought about intersectionality, this impacts you more if you're a woman, even though women outperform men at KS2, KS4, and at university in terms of education. We know this impacts you more if you have a disability of any kind, and we know that this impacts you more if you are from an ethnic minority background. So it's really important to be able to measure social mobility, and so data is hugely important for us in that. But it's also about making sure we think about regions, and we see London outperforming in education in a way that other regions in the UK are not. So lots to think about in terms of how we can progress. But we also do a lot of work with employers in terms of thinking about not just the people that they accept. And as you mentioned, they're doing great jobs in grad recruitment, but it's about who progresses and how they progress and whether you're measuring that or not.
Lots to think about there. Rob?
Thank you. So social mobility in terms of it being hindered by a lack of housing opportunity, I think, is key to where I'm going. So housing is often mentioned as a negative or a difficult subject, but actually it's core in terms of personal, family, community chances. Insecure or secure, housing plays massive importance in terms of family planning, community empowerment, health, social inequality, etc. As recently as 1996, 65% of 25... Try that again. As recently as 1996, 65% of those aged 25 to 34 owned their home. Now that's 41%. Britain has the 5th lowest home ownership rate in Europe, despite 81% of people wanting to own their own home. For people, it's about...
Can you move your mic up? They still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? No?
Someone's running to the front frantically, so...
Okay. Give me a second. Okay. Can you hear me now? Perfect. There we go. Okay. Shall I go again? So the crux of what I was saying there is that social mobility is linked to housing quite massively. And as recently as 1996, 65% of 25 to 34-year-olds owned their own home. Now that's 41%. We've got the 5th lowest home ownership rate in Europe, despite well over 80% of people wanting to own their own home. And for many people, it's about building social capital. That's a stake in society. That's putting down roots. That's starting a family, getting involved in community. First and fundamentally, it is probably about building more homes. We have a supply crisis. If we just take the recent migration figures, a net migration of 606,000 people, if we apply 2.4 as the metric to that, and divide it by 2.4 people per household, that's an extra 250,000 homes we need just to deliver that. That doesn't take into account the changing family structure, the fact that we're living longer and need rising in general. But it's not just social mobility for buyers, or young people, it's about the whole housing spectrum. Mortgage, social rent, shared ownership, affordable rent, rent to buy, or any other tenure. That lack of supply is harming all of those. For us, it's not just about placemaking, it's about placemaking. It's not just about building houses. It's about creating communities where we deliver shops, cafes, village greens, schools, and all the other things that people need when they come together to have a true, proper community. And that can be done and should be done in partnership with the public sector, but done properly. Providing a full mix of housing, the 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, the 3 and 4 bedroom family homes, the bungalows for downsizers, all mixed in together as a community, not just focused on commuter housing. And we think that community has fallen down the agenda. We know we completed recently a piece of work with Oxfordshire County Council, looking at how good community creation addresses social and health inequality, how we give people a better chance. And all of that is possible if it's done properly in the right way, but it needs to be done in volume. And that's something that we're working with our partners to try and achieve.
Lots to think about there, and we'll get into the policy weeds later. I should say this session is being live streamed, and unfortunately not by my choice, there won't be a Q&A at the end of the session. I've just been asked to inform you of that. I just wanted to ask you, Stuart, in your opening remarks, you were very proudly stating, you're from a working class background in Glasgow. How did you get to the top of a big financial institution? And do you think young people today have those same opportunities?
Probably I'm a bit shy to answer that. I got lots of privilege growing up, despite being working class. I think being a white male, and my mum and dad worked exceptionally hard, and I got through secondary education and worked hard. And I don't think we should be embarrassed to say we have to work hard. Worked hard, had the right type of diligence, and then took every opportunity in front of me, some of which weren't obvious. But it was all about really trying to progress myself. What happened for me that perhaps made a pivot point from being management level to leadership level was actually finding cause or purpose. And that can sometimes be the breakthrough moment. I worked at RBS. Yes, it went spectacularly bust. And the question then was, do you hang around and try and fix it, or do you run off claiming it was someone else's fault? I decided to hang around and try and fix it, and it gave me cause. I then worked in HSBC, setting up the ring-fence bank in the UK, and it was all about actually making sure that HSBC gave back to the UK, rather than simply offshoring the profits out to Asia. And I felt that that was quite a purposeful thing to do. And then ultimately joining Skipton Group has been all about helping people into homes and helping people make the money work harder. So purpose plays a big part in creating motivation. So the more purposeful the jobs, I think the more we'll create the drive and, you know, people, generations coming up.
But do you think there were any doors that you managed to pry open that perhaps generations today might find more difficult?
Yeah, so actually, if we go back to housing, when I was moving, there was never a question of could I afford the rent. And we, both myself and my now wife, we weren't getting paid particularly handsomely in the first jobs. Yet we took a house in Putney or in Clapham in London because the rental costs were reasonable, still a reasonably high proportion of income, but actually affordable. That simply wouldn't be the case now. Similarly, when we chose to buy and get onto the property ladder, it was achievable on relatively meagre incomes. It's not achievable anymore. And so we have to change some of the orthodoxies around things like you got to buy it, perhaps you share the purchase, you know, shared equity ownership, a little bit more rent to buy type propositions to give people that opportunity. So I think certainly there's a barrier now in terms of that social mobility.
We will get on to housing, but I just wanted to ask you, Sophie, in terms of getting working class people to rise to the top, like Stuart mentioned in his opening remarks, how do you do that?
So I think we need to stop talking about how do we get the people better, how do we make them more confident, how do we get them more networks. And this is about looking at the processes within the employer space. So are our leaders accountable? Do they really want to bring about change? And are they accountable for bringing about that change? And also role modelling, I think that's hugely important. People within an organisation need to look up to others that look, feel, have the same experiences as them. So I tell an anecdote about my own experience. I went for an interview. The interviewer said, we both went to the University of Bristol, because I'd mentioned going to university in Bristol. I'd been to an ex-poly, she'd been to a Russell group, and I thought at that point, I don't want to mention that I haven't been to University of Bristol. A couple of years later, by chance, I happened to be talking with the chairman of the City of London who had been to an ex-poly, and he was talking to some academy students here. That was my light bulb moment. That was when I thought I could do it, but I needed that chance interaction with that person that had had a similar experience to me, and that gave me the inner confidence to move on. But in terms of the processes, as you say, figure out the data, know your starting point, know what your workforce looks like, and figure out the challenges that are within your organisation. Are there particular challenges in particular occupations? Front office versus back office, for example, in financial services, and use that data. It's not collecting data just for the sake of collecting data. ID check on promotions, work allocation, access to senior sponsors. Who's getting the visible projects? The projects that get you noticed and get you in front of the people that can make the decisions. Who has access to senior sponsors? We know in financial services that's so important, but we know that employees from working class backgrounds are 17% less likely to have access to a senior sponsor. So how are they allocated? We know it's human nature for us to support individuals that remind us of ourselves when we were younger. It's in our comfort zone to do that. We need to override that natural instinct and ensure that people from different backgrounds have access to influential people within the organisation. And then also setting targets. Figure out where you are now as an employer, figure out where you want to get to as an employer, and set a target around that. The City of London led a task force on this. There are 5 key recommendations, which I recommend you have a look at. And then I would say this, join Progress together and find out what other organisations are doing in this space.
Just a quick follow-up on that, though. Do you think targets work? We hear about diversity targets in the workplace. I've been at workplaces which have diversity targets. I tick a lot of those boxes. And I have to say, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And obviously there's a lot of stigma attached to them as well. And also this idea of working class, you know, the HR sends around the form and you tick what you are, you can say you prefer not to answer. How do you identify these groups? As Resham said, you know, there's no box for working class and, you know, no definition.
Well, there is a kind of a definition in terms of what the question that's asked in the census and the question that's recommended by the Social Mobility Commission. And of our members, 100% of our members collect data on parental occupation at 14. So employers are beginning to centre on that. In terms of targets, it's not the same thing as a quota. It's not saying you must get a certain individual from a certain background to a certain level, but know where you want to get to. In the same way that as a business you have other targets for other areas of business. You have climate targets, you have your profit targets. If you actually want to make a move on this and you actually want to bring about change, you have to treat this like any other change management programme within the organisation. Otherwise it just remains fluffy side of the desk activity.
Fair enough. Resham, whoever comes into power or stays in power after the next election, they're looking, you know, a pretty tight borrowing position. We're still borrowing, deficit is still close to record levels. There's not a lot of money around, basically. What are you telling policymakers they need to do to improve social mobility at a time when there's not a lot of money around?
Yeah, it's a really important question because, as you say, there isn't that much money, but even if there was, a lot of it is not about money. It's about what you do with what you're spending already. It's about how you shape culture. It's about how you shape society. I mean, we know, for example, that the least advantaged children start school 4.5 months behind their peers, and by the time they leave school at 18, they're 18.5 months behind. In addition, we know that if you read to your child for 15 minutes a day at the age of 3, by the time they reach 7, their educational outcomes have improved on average 5 to 6 months. So there are lots of things you can do to support the improvement of social mobility without spending more money. And some of that is around targets, some of that is around data. If it gets measured, it gets done. So, you know, we talk a lot about children on free school meals, for example, and that's really important to think about the support we're providing them with extra education or extra support. But actually, what about the children in the cohort just above that? There's millions of children that actually don't get educational support or financial support. So it's about thinking with the money we have, are we educating in the right way? And part of that is, what are we teaching young people? So, you know, Sophie mentioned not wanting to talk about her university, you know, and that feeling out of place. We see a lot of young people who undermatch. So if you're from a less well-off socioeconomic background, you will undermatch. You ask for less in salary because potentially the grad salary you're being offered is more than anyone in your household has ever earned. So you don't ask for more, you don't expect more. You feel self-conscious about your accent perhaps, or you don't know how to network because you've never had to network, you've never been taught that by parents because your parents didn't do the jobs that required that. And I think it's also about reframing our culture. So you don't have to spend money to get apprenticeships to be viewed as a really viable alternative. So when employers have apprenticeships, too often you see it as a two-path route. So we'll take our less well-off employees, we'll stick them onto apprenticeships, and the route never really achieves what the grad route does. Actually, no, it should be that it's just a different route into employment, and employers should be giving those apprentices the support and education and guidance that they can be on the exact same progression path as the grads. And so there's lots of different things you can do, but really it's a multi-pronged approach. And until we tackle housing, that's going to be really difficult because, as you mentioned, some of the figures, and you've also given us some figures on housing, in the 80s and 90s, it took on average 3 years for the average 30-year-old to save up a deposit. Now, that average 30-year-old would take almost 20 years to save for a deposit. And it's not just about education or income, it's about, can you move to a better paid job, or can you take up opportunities? Well, if you can't afford to live in the place, no, you can't. Can you afford to have children if you can't afford an extra bedroom or a place to put your kids? No, you can't. And we've seen 157,000 fewer children being born between the mid-90s and 2014 than we would have had. So it's huge now because we're turning the haves and the have-nots into a whole range of life choices about who can actually even afford to have a family or do better for themselves because they can't move. We're trapping people where they are, and we have to acknowledge that regional opportunities are not the same across the UK, and until we can offer people geographical mobility, we can't offer them true social mobility.
So these changes are influencing our life choices, basically.
Absolutely.
Rob, you're in charge of effectively building entire communities across the UK, planning them, designing them, building them, getting people to live in them. What's your take on, first, this issue of social mobility and how to ensure people get on in life? And secondly, of course, how can we get more people on the housing ladder?
Well, I mean, on the first part, we've got to create communities that are communities for all, and it's that simple. You know, we've got to, when we look at new communities, it's often that housing is delivered, but it's not delivering the right mix of housing. So there's not enough affordable housing in there, and truly affordable housing, affordable rent, social rent, as well as private housing. And we need that mix. We need that mix delivered up and down the country, wherever communities are created or we're adding to an existing community. And we need to create that opportunity for all, just to have a stable household environment. You know, so they are stable, they're living in the same home, and that's the first basic step to then creating a raft of other opportunities. So it's important that we deliver housing where it's required in the country. You know, we talk about different areas where it's more and more difficult to afford to be on the housing ladder or to afford to rent a home. And therefore you start to make different life choices as a consequence. And you don't have the kids, you don't retire at the age you want to, you don't do whatever it is at the different stages of that mobility. So for us, it is about creating communities with a properly diverse mix of housing. You know, where it's tenure blind, where it's all mixed in together, where we don't treat one sector of society differently to another because they can or can't afford a property, etc., which has perhaps been the norm in some cases. And I think, ultimately that opportunity does come down to the numbers that we deliver. The basic right. We, as I said earlier, if you just take the migration figures this year, 600,000 people divided by 2.4, which is the metric that we measure all households on, 2.4 people per household, that's 250,000 homes needed just for those people. That doesn't account for the shortfall. It doesn't account for the people that are coming through, becoming 30 this year that want to aspire to have their own home. It doesn't account for the fact that people are living longer. It doesn't account for the fact that the family structure is different now. And a lot of breakdowns in family structure where it changes don't require 2 one-bedroom flats. They require 2 three-bedroom houses. So that we need to be delivering much greater volumes, but all over the country, but particularly in the parts of the country where it's absolutely required.
But as part of that, do you think people need to perhaps move away from the big city? Because what we hear is, a lot of people want to live in London, they can't afford to buy a house in London, rents are extortionate, they're pushed further and further out. You build communities that are far from there, but perhaps the job opportunities are not the same. Is there a compromise that has to be reached?
Fundamentally, we need to build everywhere in much bigger volume. The new communities angle, I think we are in a changing place. We are seeing more and more people work from home part-time or some of the time. We're seeing a missing opportunity, not just in our biggest cities, but across, you take, for instance, the tech corridor, looking at Oxford to Cambridge. That's life sciences, that's tech, that's research, it's all those things. Massive employment opportunity at the moment, massive job creation potential, yet we're just not delivering the housing there to support that and to support those people that want to work in those areas. So it's not just the existing large cities, it's everywhere where job creation could be, and people want to be.
One more, I will move on. Is it easy to build a house in the UK?
No.
Care to elaborate?
Listen, I've been doing it a few years, but the planning regime now is more difficult than ever. We see greater and greater regulation, greater and greater change. It's not consistent in terms of where we are. There's a constant need to tinker or change with it, or put this on hold or change that. And as a consequence, the numbers are falling. You know, we will deliver circa 150,000 homes this year. We've been at over 200,000 for the last 5 years as a nation. And it's forecast we could fall as low as 110,000 next year. Planning permissions are falling quite dramatically. We've got a lot of places where local plans are on hold and will be. We're held up by neutralities, other bits and pieces. So, you know, it is more and more difficult and stifling our ability to grow, I think, and to deliver for people.
And just in the 1960s, we built around 3.5 million homes in that decade. The 2000s and 2010s, we've averaged 1.5 million. And the population growth and need is far higher than it was in the 1960s. And then people wonder why in the last 40 to 50 years we've had over 200% in real terms increase in house prices.
Yeah, I've written a lot about house building, and I was talking to my colleague this morning actually about a project that's near him, and I hope he doesn't mind, I'm not going to name him, he lives in Redhill, and there's a planning application to build 3, they're not tower blocks, but 3 blocks of flats close enough to his house for him to be asked. And he logged on to the council just to see, you know, who was for and who was against. And there were about 7 people who said they supported it, and about 800 who said they were against it. Everyone talks about NIMBYs. It's alive and well. And you know, some of these people do have legitimate concerns about how their area will be changed and the pressure on public services as well, which I guess is what you're trying to address, Rob.
So you're absolutely right. We sponsored a piece of work back in 2014, 2015 with Shelter, and they surveyed a huge number of people. I think it was something like 80,000 people, looking at their attitudes towards housing. And you're absolutely right, there is, and quite rightly so, people that have a valid reason to object to new homes being built. But quite often, I think, and perhaps we as an industry haven't helped ourselves, and the way housing is delivered in this country hasn't helped either. We need to deliver infrastructure alongside it. People need to see schools being built. They need to see more doctors' places being created. They need to see better mobility and transport being offered, rather than just houses being put onto villages and towns, and the service is not keeping pace or coming ahead of that. And I think that's a lot of the time what creates this discord where people feel, ultimately most people accept that housing is needed. They get the argument about population increase, they get the argument about opportunity, house price rises, mobility offering, but they don't see the services keeping pace with it in their local area, and therefore think they're going to be worse off and want to object to it as a consequence, which is perfectly valid. We need to find a way to deliver everything people need, not just housing, alongside the housing.
Stuart, can I come to you? I mean, we've just heard about the struggle to get on the housing ladder for some first-time buyers. Skipton's launched a 100% mortgage this year. I just wondered, what's been the take-up of that product and who's applying for it?
Sure, I'll just link back to Rob's point, and I will answer that. Rob's spot on. There's an element of we've lost the faith in the market forces as well. The first thing you have to have is jobs and people. And once you've got jobs and people, you create tax revenues, and then the tax revenues can support the services. But to do that, you have to have a plan, both a plan in the centre, central teams, and then a plan locally to actually support the growth in the communities. And I think people have lost faith or trust that there will be a capital P plan in the centre and then a local P plan that actually allows people to get behind the type of development that we need. Because the numbers that you've shared, look at that immigrant growth, look at the natural population shift, we need to make more houses. I think that's beyond doubt. And our Skipton response to that was in recognition of the fact that we don't have enough houses, and therefore housing prices have shot up that 200% that you've mentioned. And that meant that our children, other youngsters, first-time buyers, because they're no longer youngsters. First-time buyers, last time we surveyed was 37, it's probably touching 40 now. And so our first-time buyers, we used to sort of think of them are completely changed. And we thought, do you know what, there's got to be a break in this. And financial service products have got stuck a little bit in an orthodoxy, almost in a fear out of the financial crisis, about the amount of debt that you can afford to take. But actually it's about the amount you can afford. And if you can prove that you're affording making making rental payments, then why shouldn't you pay less for a mortgage and have a bit more to put aside? Yes, house prices might reduce in the short term, but they've been a pretty good bet. And with a shortage of stock, I'd say as an asset class, it's a fairly safe bet as well over the medium term. So we've got to let people into that ladder. Specifically, we launched that 100% track record mortgage. We've had more than 55,000 people inquiring after it. What's the profile? Well, the first lend that we did was in Dundee. I'm proud of that, I'm Scottish. Was in Dundee. The lady who's a divorcee with 2 children had been renting. Her rental payments were £1,200. The mortgage cost for the house that she wants, which is quite close by, is £800. So that's £400 a month in her pocket, and now a place where she can put a nail in the wall and actually call her own. I've got pictures of them, and I think it's a fabulous story. That's a typical profile. But then the second one we did, so that house property price was about £130,000, £140,000. Go to Dundee, great weather. The other place was in London, £600,000, which is actually our maximum lend. And that was the second property we did. So you'd be surprised it's a very non-homogeneous group, first-time buyers now.
Given what you said, would you support mortgages of upwards of 100%?
So this is all about affordability. Where you start to place more leverage in, where it's more than the value of the home, it becomes very different to value the security against the lend. So no. However, I do think there is room for us to lend against the mortgage and a bit more to support home improvements and green improvements, energy efficiency improvements in homes, but I certainly wouldn't be pushing that more than 100%.
But do you also think there's more room for innovation? As you said, you're looking at rental track records, and others are looking at Netflix payments.
Our first move, well, probably wouldn't go the Netflix route. I'm not sure that points to strong affordability. The reality is we do need to, as a financial services sector, we need to adjust the way that we underwrite, and they adjust the product structures as well. So I wouldn't look for more leverage than the security's worth. I think that's heading towards irresponsibility. But shared ownership, shared equity, rent to buy, actually a responsibility to help people in the mixed type accommodation situations, such as those that Rob and others are building. All of this plays a part. Community housing, looking at key sectors, particularly those that we're most reliant on, nurses, doctors. How do we structure both mortgage payments and rental payments so that they actually start to get a share in the proceeds of any house price inflation? There's plenty of scope to be more innovative, and actually we often hide behind the regulators. One thing I'll tell you in launching the product we launched, there really wasn't high degrees of resistance if you think it through the lens of the customer.
And just on the lens of the customer, the challenge and the reason why the home ownership is important. So the Open Data Institute did a study last year looking at fuel poverty. And you know, when people think of people living in fuel poverty, most people will tell you they think it's pensioners living in fuel poverty. Actually, 29% of households that are experiencing fuel poverty have the oldest occupant of that house being between 16 and 24 years old. So it's students, it's multi-occupation homes, and the reason that is landlords don't have the incentive to improve the energy efficiency of the home. The incentive structure is not there, and the tenants don't have the security of it being a long-term let, so they also do not or cannot afford to redo the home. So again, when you think about social mobility and opportunity, we have an enormous number of young people stuck in cold homes suffering fuel poverty, who you can imagine the impact that has on your ability to work and succeed and learn in life if you are struggling, and that also ties into food poverty too. So it really does impact every area of your life, and we need to think about, when we design our policies, not just the homeowners, but who is living in that home and what does it do for their life.
Just on that, in terms of housing and owning a home seems to be one of the main points of intergenerational tension. Who owns, who doesn't, who got on the ladder, what kind of interest rate they were paying then and now, how long your term has to be. And I just wondered, to the whole panel, I mean, what does a housing system that works for all generations look like?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I guess Skipton Group is quite a strong part in the housing part. So first of all, we've got to be careful that it's not one size fits all. So it's not all about ownership. It's really important. People often are critical of buy-to-let landlords. Responsible buy-to-let landlords have a huge role to play alongside the state sector. So you've got those that can own, those that aspire to own, who you can support, such as the track record mortgage or other products we've talked about, those that will have a lifetime of rental, but with responsible landlords who are incented through tax breaks, etc., to actually invest in the property, to make it habitable, to make it energy efficient, to create the demand into the economy that then fuels the house building. And then the social housing, where again the mandate is to create responsible homes and maintain them and upkeep them. Quite often I've seen communities where the new houses being built, the new social houses being built, are far superior to those that were there before. So it's about creating a sort of balanced housing stock that caters for all of those different constituent parts. But against the social opportunity behind it, don't forget how much housing generates for the economy, which then lifts everything. Rob had shared some stats earlier. I've seen stats that suggest that housing development, housing moves, housing property, the trades that go on around housing and when you move and when you buy, and also the amount of trade work that's going to be required to make Georgian and Victoria homes more energy efficient, could be a huge boost to GDP, which lifts all the lifeboats across the UK.
I mean, in addition, I agree, but in addition, by 2035, around 5% of the population will be over 85. I don't want to think about the implications for pensions, and I know that's not for this panel discussion, but it does really mean that we have to think about the houses we're building. Are they habitable by people over 85? Are the doorways wide enough for wheelchairs? Are they usable by someone who might not have the mobility they had? I personally am not a fan of stamp duty. I think it increases friction in an already challenging market. I also think it's a disincentive for older people to downsize if they're still paying stamp duty, and it disproportionately affects people in the southeast. But that aside, I think it's recognizing that people will potentially want to buy, rent at different stages of their life, and it's about thinking that young people today are facing far greater difficulties. House prices are now around 12 times the average income, whereas only 30-ish years ago it was 4 times average income. So it's about recognizing that we have put, I say we, over decades we have created a situation where young people today are basically at the whims of the market and waiting to inherit, or are talking about moving elsewhere, or are losing out on job opportunities and family opportunities. So there's no easy answer, and I'm not a housing expert. But the reality is we are creating more and more inequality, not just intergenerational, but between young people who have the familial support behind them.
Correct.
That entrenches where they can live, where they can work. I mean, we talk about internships, we talk about apprenticeships. It doesn't matter if you're offered the chance to get through an interview if you cannot afford to move to London or to where your internship is. And so that's why the housing is so important. And yes, people are working from home, but younger people, especially from less socioeconomic backgrounds, need the networking more than the others. They need to be able to be at the meetings, they need to be able to be at the offsites, they need to be at the water cooler, so to speak. So actually it's about thinking that we are building up huge problems for the future, and young people will have no choice but to leave the UK if we don't tackle this in the next decade.
Wow, so do the panelists agree that the implications might be that serious?
I think I agree with everything that's been said there. We do need a multifaceted approach here. It is all tenures. It needs to be not just affordable rent, but social rent. It needs to be ownership. It needs to be part ownership. I think shared ownership has a really good box to tick, and for a lot of people it's the right way to get that ownership and that security. It's interesting with landlords. We've been on a campaign probably now for 7, 8 years, the government, to try and reduce the attractiveness of being a private landlord. You know, the tax benefits, change the model, try and get more to institutionalised landlords that don't behave like some of those, you know, irresponsible private landlords. Yet actually the bulk of private landlords aren't irresponsible. But what's the incentive for them to stay in the marketplace, to keep renting? And we're seeing rental numbers decrease quite dramatically due to that tax position. But secondly, then to invest in those properties and make them more secure for the people living in them from a financial point of view, in terms of the cost of living there, that energy security. You know, I mean, from our point of view, 27% of the housing stock that will exist in 2050 is yet to be built. Why isn't all of it net zero? We build net zero today, a proportion of the housing we deliver is net zero. Why isn't everything we're delivering in this country net zero in lifetime use for housing? No bills for heating the home. It's possible, we do it at scale, but you know, we're still kicking the can down the road.
Right, we spent a lot of time talking about housing. I want to move on, Sophie, and ask you about the role of businesses in improving social mobility.
So we know that employers have a role to play in supporting their employees, in delivering the best products and services for their customers, and also returns for their investors. They're responsible for that. So I mentioned earlier that employees from working class backgrounds progress 25% slower than peers, with zero link to job performance. So if there is a group of employees that are not getting promoted, yet they're high performing, then employers have a huge role to play in delivering for investors and such like. So for me, this is more than just social mobility. This is about access to talent at all levels of the organisation. And at the moment, that's just not happening. So we know there are high-performing employees which are not getting ahead. And evidence from the Bridge Group shows that employees are wasting energy conforming to dominant cultures. That's impacting individual productivity. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the impact on organisational productivity? What's the impact on the sector as a whole? And I'm talking about UK financial services because that's the sector I work in. So for me, I think it's time for employers to redefine our perceptions of talent. So too often it's led by fit and by polish and less on performance. So do we need, for all the jobs in the workplace, gravitas, the ability to hold the room, that external displays of confidence? Arguably not for every single job. So yes, fairness plays a part, but there is a business case for this. So I was speaking to an asset manager member of Progress Together recently, and they said they'd seen a 4-fold increase in inquiries from investors around socioeconomic diversity in the last 12 months. Investors are starting to take an interest in this. Also the regulators, so socioeconomic background was an element of the financial services regulators' discussion paper a couple of years ago. I wouldn't be surprised if it's also in the consultation that's due out in the next 6 months. But innovation too is key here. So if we have diversity of thought at the top, then that's going to help us remain to be globally competitive as an organisation. And Penny Mordaunt mentioned earlier today, lack of plurality of thought makes countries weak nations. It's the same for employers. We need a diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds at all levels of the organisation to be able to make good business decisions.
Can I ask the two people with CEO next to their name the same question? What's the role of corporations in improving social mobility?
So, first of all, I would agree with everything you've said. The more that the commercial imperative is the one that drives here, but it's that balanced commercial imperative around outcome. So whenever I'm looking to hire, we're looking for people with passion, engagement, energy. We're looking with people who are smart, not Oxbridge smart, but commercial smart and driven. And we're looking for people with in senior roles with a proven track record of delivering outcome. None of that points to gender, sexuality, or indeed social class or background of parents, etc. And the more that we can start to move beyond the concept of how you fit, how well you network, I think the more successful any company and then ultimately the country will become.
I concur completely. For us, we are looking for the best person for that job, and that best person to do that job, the ability to do that, the enthusiasm, the energy a lot of the time is absolutely key to it. It's not about where they come from, what they've done, what their background is, etc. We're not interested. We just want somebody who shows the energy, the enthusiasm, the passion, or somebody who, and we employ across a diverse mix. We've got site-based staffs that are traditional trades, right the way through to architects, to landscape designers, to planners, to engineers, etc., etc. So we've got a complete mix, and all of them come from different backgrounds into all those fields. Some come through traditional routes in those fields, and that could be very much sort of an apprentice site-based onto site. It could be through university onto site, and it could be the absolute reverse into all of those other departments as well. So it's a complete mix from everywhere, and we want that mix. We want that absolute, spectrum of people, because it creates such a great workplace.
To a degree, we've got to force it a bit as well. You asked the question earlier about KPIs or quotas. I'm anti-quota, always have been. I think it forces an outcome which delivers poor commercial outcomes. But I'm massively pro-metrics, because metrics force new thinking. What do I mean by that? When we started to build metrics about gender diversity, we started to have much more balanced shortlists. We started to make sure that there were male and female representation in any interview panels, even the concept of blind CV, which I'm not sure totally works, because there's always a he or a she reference somewhere within it. So for me, when you have an objective, it gets talked about. And when it gets talked about, new actions, new ideas sort of result. So I think to achieve the outcomes that Rob and I have talked about, sometimes that nudge of having a KPI but not a quota becomes quite important.
It's being really brave with your recruitment too. I mean, some consultancies, strategy consultancies, some of the bigger ones, are now recognizing that you may have the skill set, the capabilities, but you don't know anyone who's able to help you prepare for an interview. So they are now sending out practice case studies to people applying to say, and they're putting them on the website as well, to say, if you're thinking of applying, this is what a strategy consultant does. This is how you'll be treated in interview. Ahead of the interview, they send a pack saying, these are some of the practice case studies for strategy consulting, along with model answers. Because if you have access to people who have worked in a professional field, they can help you prepare. But that doesn't mean you're actually going to be better at the job. It's also about thinking about lived experiences and allyship. So if you have people who are willing to and want to, explaining to you what they found challenging as they progressed is really valuable. But then it's thinking about the unpaid and the emotional labour too. I've worked, it's not about socioeconomic background, but I've worked in places where I'm in male-dominated fields where I'm often the only woman and often the only ethnic minority. And I can't tell you how many jobs fairs I'd get carted off to. No recognition in my KPIs or in my kind of measurables or billables that I was actually doing this unpaid labour. So it actually hindered me more. It became a compounding effect where, because of certain, I didn't get invited out to the strategy team lunch once. And they said, oh, we just did a boys' lunch. And I said, well, but I'm the only woman on the team. So you basically all went for lunch without me. I've heard examples of people saying, oh, when clients got taken to the cricket, they were told, oh, we didn't invite you. We thought you were more of a football kind of person. So it's about thinking about who you're bringing in, who you're leaving out, and how you're rewarding the labour people have to do, because often they're the people who are progressing less quickly anyway.
Lots to think about that. I am conscious of time, but just to end, I just wanted to ask the panel, if you had a magic wand, etc., what's the one thing policymakers can do to improve social mobility? Sophie?
I would support the regulators to collect more data on this and to publish workforce data.
Stuart?
I'll go to housing, unsurprisingly. Big P, so central government policy, and little p, local planning.
Resham?
More houses.
If
Sorry,
more houses.
for the
I
reason
think
of more
that's clear
houses.
from the panel.
I don't have good alliteration for a cheeky two, but early years education and supporting parents to be good parents. If you haven't had role models yourself, it's very hard to know what good parenting is. And we're kind of like, oh, you learn how to do neonatal stuff, but then you have the baby and it's like, okay, well, good, don't mess this up. And then lifelong learning. How are we supporting people throughout their careers and their lives to continue to educate and learn so they can improve their life chances?
And Rob?
I'm going to echo the thoughts with regard to planning. In terms of housing, you know, we have to have government setting policy that is consistent, that it sticks to. We have to have local plans in place at a local level so we can deliver that mix of homes of all tenures to create the opportunity and the fairness in society. Yeah.
And with that, if you could thank my panellists, Sophie Hulm, Stuart Haire, Resham, Kotecha, and Rob Boughton. Thanks so much. Thank you.